Afshin Ratansi, and welcome to Going Underground, broadcasting all around the world from the heart of the Middle East, where Israel, armed to the teeth by Donald Trump, has launched a renewed siege in its genocidal war in Gaza. That, when most of the world looks to the global economic superpower China, which far outstrips the USA in GDP by PPP. Today is the third plenary of the 14th Communist National People's Congress, setting a growth target of 5% and increases in war spending by 7.2%. Why the war spending? Arguably because of the old world. Just days after a London summit kicked off a decision by European elites to arm for war on Russia, and a Donald Trump spoke to both houses of Congress, doubling down on his desire for peace, the EU met in Brussels. The extraordinary meeting was for EU elites to arrange the impoverishment of EU populations in the pursuit of war. That, as Washington and Moscow organize restoration of diplomatic relations, direct flights and easing of sanctions. Joining me now is Clare Daly, former MEP, who alongside Mick Wallace was a rare voice in the European Parliament against NATO militarism. She joins me now from Kildare in Ireland. Clare, thanks so much for coming back on. I've got this strange Japanese newspaper, the Financial Times, breathlessly talking, as it has all week, about the prospects for more and more war spending in Europe. And since you're in Ireland, not in Brussels, where you're normally when you're at the European Parliament, I better start by just asking you, it says here, Ireland's foreign minister said yesterday the militarily neutral nation will not be found wanting over any future European peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. It even talks about a cabinet bill from your Taoiseach and a previous Taoiseach insisting in no way undermines Ireland's commitment to the UN. What's going on in Ireland? You joining up on the war on Russia?
Yeah, it is quite extraordinary, and of course his words are a complete lie. This is absolutely against the United Nations and totally undermining our traditional position of neutrality, which in fairness the political establishment in Ireland have long been wanting to undermine, but now in this new world they're turbocharging it, and there is a proposal going before the Irish Parliament that the basis upon which we send troops abroad, which they call it a triple lock, traditionally Irish troops would only go abroad with the UN mandate and with the backing of the government and the Irish Parliament, but they want to remove the UN mandate from that, so freeing them up to engage in European military missions, which against the backdrop of the von der Leyen announcement and the acceleration of military spending and war drum banging, would see the potential for Irish men and women in our defence forces being sent abroad to pursue really European imperial aims. It's quite extraordinary, but they are seizing the present moment in order to do something that they've long sought to do anyway.
I mean, few things probably surprise you as regards foreign policy of these NATO European nations, but what did you make of the British Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer using a phrase that is now used across Europe, was used on Thursday, the EU and UK calling themselves the coalition of the willing, echoing the Iraq war invasion, which killed, wounded or displaced tens of millions of people in this region where I'm speaking to you from?
Well, yes, and it was almost like paying homage to Bush and Blair and their illegal war, which saw 1 million Iraqis killed and slaughtered, and the destruction of that country. It sort of tells you where these people are going. And we also hear them repeating the Netanyahu slogan, peace through strength. And, you know, this is the direction that these people are clearly going. I mean, the truth is they've been on a military bend for a long number of years now, and they seem to be dumbing down on it. It's interesting that the figures that they're talking about 800 billion on defence, they've even come out and said that Europe has to get used to trimming its welfare budget, because they obviously haven't got the money for paying for all of this, if we want to become a warfare state. And of course, nobody asked the people of Europe about that. Quite clearly, people would much prefer to see that money spent on things that would actually make them safe, like a roof over their head, enough food on the table to deal with the devastating cost of living crisis that these people caused in the first place with their ridiculous response to an involvement in NATO's incursion on Russia's border, and tragically using Ukraine in that aim. I mean, it is disaster all around, and they're actually doing the absolute opposite of what they should be doing. And the consequences for Europe, if this keeps going, will be devastating, in my opinion. It already has been. But rather than seizing on an opportunity for peace on the continent of Europe, they seem to be desperately doing everything they can to make sure that there's some sort of a war going, or even getting worse. I mean, it's
Yeah.
astounding. I can't make it out myself. I mean, I knew that these were the most incompetent group of leaders ever at the helm of Europe, but they're largely incoherent as well, because while they're whinging about the US, at the same time, they're whimpering at Donald Trump's feet and saying, oh, no, 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 we want to work with you. We will increase our military spend. We'll bring it up to 5%. We'll go there. It's disastrous for Europe.
And yet, no vote, as you said, in the European Parliament itself, none in the national government parliaments of the European Union, none in Britain. Just, you spent years in the European Parliament. Just paint us a picture of how they come to be so out of touch. I mean, are these people ignorant of why the proxy war in Russia started, or are they benefiting from this in some way? Why would they endanger their populations in this way?
The European institutions have been completely captured by the military-industrial complex, and this is a process going on over many years. What started as an economic union became much more involved in issues like foreign affairs and so on through the Lisbon Treaty, which was rejected in Ireland. We're the only country that actually has a vote of its people if we want to change European treaties, and we voted against that treaty, and we're made to go back and vote for it. And within that was the embryo, if you like, of the beginnings of Europe as an entity separate from its 27 member states, getting involved in foreign affairs and getting involved in defence matters. They got a high representative, which was Joseph Borrell, whom, when we were in the Parliament, thought was pretty dreadful, but he's been replaced by Kaja Kallas, which brings pretty dreadful onto a completely new scale of catastrophic war hawk. And
Kaja Kallas, who said it's not that bad if Russia is broken up, the entire Russian Federation, by this war through Ukraine.
Absolutely astounding, like goading Russia on its borders and then blaming Russia for any potential response. I mean, it's crazy stuff. We were at a meeting in the European Parliament where Jeffrey Sachs said, this is not even baby geopolitics. He said, this is not thinking at all. And I think he's right. They are not thinking at all. They've been completely, about 10 years ago, Europe decided to look at its defence. How would they make themselves safer? And to come up with the answer, they invited what they called, bizarrely, a group of personalities. And they weren't movie stars. They were actually, in the majority, they were representatives of Europeans' defence industry. And they came up with the solution, which was, do you know how you'll make yourself safe now? The best way you'll do that is by spending a lot more money on militarisation. And from that, surprise, surprise, that's what they did. And the very same companies who advised them, who said, we're your partners, we're not industry, we're your partners, they were the beneficiaries of those contracts. And that's where you saw the first European Defence Fund. And this is all before the war in Ukraine, where for the first time they were giving 8 billion euros in a direct European Defence Fund. They had a misnamed European Peace Facility, specifically allowing expenditure on arms. And of course, once the war in Ukraine started, this was turbocharged. So an original budget off the books of about 6 billion suddenly became 17 billion, with 2/3 of that going on military expenditure in Ukraine to fuel the war and keep it going. And it's been program after program. And now we have figures about 800 billion being spoken about. But the interesting thing about that is that the McKinsey report on European defence last year pinpointed that that was the direction that Europe was going to go on anyway. So there's somebody behind the scenes, or organisations behind the scenes, pulling the strings. And since the announcements, we've seen shares in BAE and Leonardo and Thales, all of these European defence companies skyrocket. I mean, sadly, also shares and on the stock exchange for Elbit Systems, because one of the biggest beneficiaries of European defence, of course, is the genocidal state of Israel. And yet Europe claims that it is doing this because they're worried about, oh, Russia has invaded a sovereign country, we stand for democracy, but they've enabled the destruction of Gaza, the invasion of Lebanon. They don't care about Syria. So, they don't care about these things. And they certainly don't care about the people of Ukraine. But it literally came from the capture of Europe by the military-industrial complex.
Okay, I want to return to... I want to return to the genocide in a moment, but then are you saying it's venality that Starmer, Macron, Scholz or Merz, Kaya Kallas, these people will get jobs as consultants for the military companies, or is it that they genuinely...
They're completely incompetent. They live in a bubble. The European Union is an absolute bubble. They're surrounded by a compliant media who tells them that they're doing the right thing. And it's had an effect. I mean, the Financial Times had an article saying that, for rich democratic societies like Europe to achieve reforms that you want to achieve, and unease is not enough. You have to create fear, and maybe now is the right moment. And that's actually what they're doing. And people across Europe are very afraid. I mean, I've had groups in Belgium, sort of parent groups of school children, sort of sending around messages in their WhatsApp groups saying, guys, I think we need to stock up on survival supplies here. The Finnish government are telling people to get solar-powered radios in the event of a war breaking out. Where's the effort to stop war? For diplomacy, that's what the United Nations and international relations were supposed to be, the peaceful resolution of conflict. Instead, in the war in Ukraine, they've done absolutely everything to keep it going. And while Trump may have been very ignorant in his behavior to Zelensky in the White House, the actual content of what he was saying was correct. This could have been over in 2 weeks. Now, what Zelensky should have said to him was, well, it actually would have been over in 4 weeks, but the US and Britain came in and told us to keep fighting. But he didn't say that, and that's the truth of it. And now they want the war to keep going, regardless of the devastating consequences. But I think many citizens around Europe see that, but it's almost like they're powerless to do anything about it, because the organizations and the parties of the left or whatever who used to speak out on these issues have been caught up in the ridiculous jingoism that could end up being incredibly dangerous for Europe. And of course, the US is delighted. It's hobbled a potential rival. And it's mad stuff. So I think they're brain dead. I think they are completely in a bubble. Their media tells them what they want to hear, and their industrial lobbyists are leading them on, particularly in the defence sector. But it's the people of Europe who are going to lose out, and lose out badly.
Clare Daly, I'll stop you there. More from the Irish politician and former member of the European Parliament after this break. Welcome back to Going Underground. I'm still here with the Irish politician who served as a member of the European Parliament, Clare Daly. Clare, you mentioned at the end of part one that Trump might have been behaving ignorantly in the Oval Office. I think arguably he was told the truth by Tulsi Gabbard, Lieutenant Colonel, his new Director of National Intelligence. I mean, do you think now Europeans understand that that the USA will leave NATO?
I'm at the stage where I don't know what they understand. I think they understand nothing. It's almost as if they're kind of gagging for a war with Russia. It's beyond belief. When we live beside a nuclear power on the same continent, it's just utterly bizarre. I honestly, having witnessed them over the past 5 years, incorporating and integrating European defence more and more as being synonymous with NATO. They're kind of rudderless now with Trump at the helm. They don't really know what to do. And you could almost see a situation where the US, China and Russia are sort of getting along okay. Well, maybe not China and the US, but Europe being totally excluded and running down the wrong road looking for a solution. They are utterly bankrupt. We saw that, of course, in other issues in Gaza and in other matters as well. But even on their own home turf, it's the same.
You've drawn attention to the use of Shannon Airport in Ireland before for US foreign policy. I don't know whether it made you feel happy or what you felt, that they're now, the United States is telling Britain, which hosts thousands of US troops, all those US bases, all those weapons, just telling them do not share any intelligence with Zelensky and Ukraine. It's so public, as it were, that Britain just has to obey what the United States does. But so they really are occupying troops in Europe.
Totally. And I mean, this is the incoherence of the European leadership. On the one hand, they're fighting talk and they're talking about militarizing more and they're going to stand by Ukraine and all this. But at the same time, they are almost whimpering at the feet of Trump also. It's the worst tactic. What they should do is go and talk to Russia themselves, develop an independent European foreign policy that benefits the people of Europe. Instead, they've been subservient to US interests for so long now. It's almost that they can't break out of it, even when the US is in their face, making it obvious that they are subservient. I think these are astounding times. They are so out of touch. It is terrifying that these idiots are what constitutes the leadership of Europe.
And in the European Parliament, you'd have met lots of European members of the European Parliament from very different electorates as they prepare to massively cut social welfare programs in Britain and Ireland, perhaps pensions, welfare, housing, all these different programs for this war on Russia. Just give us a picture of the scale of inequality in the European Union. I mean, I know 95 million is the figure from the European Commission. 95 million people tonight are frightened of not being able to eat.
Yeah, there is a housing crisis right across Europe now. Here in Ireland, people in relatively good employment can't afford to either rent or buy a house. There's a public services crisis really everywhere in Europe, not to mention the climate catastrophe and our responsibilities in that regard. And instead, what we've seen is billions being taken out of budgets which were designed to deal with the climate crisis being used on defence. So it's a double whammy. Not only are we taking money away from work that could be done to deal with the environmental problems, they're going to defence, the carbon footprint of which is never calculated anywhere. So there's huge crisis, a massive cost of living crisis all across Europe. And for ordinary citizens to hear that they can find 800 billion on weapons of destruction to kill people and to have their own children be killed in that process, it's off the Richter scale. And yet the media in Europe bleats and repeats that as if there is no alternative.
Is that why the media is so important, the propaganda campaign? I mean, the news channel of choice of Donald Trump, Fox News, is banned from broadcast de facto in, say, Britain. RT is obviously banned across Europe, CGTN banned from broadcast across, say, Britain. Is that why the propaganda is so important? Because this 800 billion figure you mentioned of Ursula von der Leyen, in the context of this kind of level of poverty, you'd expect social unrest and civil disobedience, but there isn't any.
Yeah, and I think the media I think Malcolm X once said it. He said, the media is the most powerful organization in the world that can make you believe that the innocent are guilty and the guilty innocent. And that's really what it is. It's a constant diet of Russophobia, of warmongering, of making people feel insecure and unsafe. It doesn't have any basis in rationality. But when you're exposed to that morning, noon and night, it has an effect. And there's a real irony here that they claim to be the democracies, the rich democracies, But there's an increasing authoritarianism now across Europe in terms of silencing dissenting views. That was very much to the fore in the war in Ukraine, where we know truth is always the first casualty of war, but at least in the war in Iraq, we know they lied and the weapons of mass destruction and all of that, but at least you could argue an anti-war position and have that debated. In the war in Ukraine, you could not argue an anti-war position. You were immediately labelled as a Putin puppet, a Kremlin stooge, a useful idiot, or whatever. And all that has had a certain effect, because, I mean, how are we in a situation where Donald Trump's proposal for peace in Ukraine has provoked this massive ratcheting up of militarization? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, the things, they said that what everybody knew, that Ukraine was never going to join NATO. That was never going to happen. He said what everybody knew and knows is that Ukraine can't win the war. It's not that they haven't fought heroically or that they're useless or anything like that. Just look at a map. Ukraine is a fraction the size of Russia, which is a giant, nuclear power on their border. Do the sums. It just doesn't make sense.
And I think Stop the War in Britain is actually for the war on Russia. Such has been the so-called left in European countries and green movements. But on censorship and propaganda, I understand it's getting pretty bad in Europe as regards the continuing genocide in Gaza, albeit that Trump stopped the aerial bombardment of Gaza. Trump is talking to Hamas, we understand. And how bad is it as regards what's happening in Palestine? Of course, it's the European Union that has been sending the arms, you mentioned Elbit systems, to carry out the genocide of our times.
The European Union has been fully complicit in the genocide since the day it started. Ursula von der Leyen green-lighted the Israeli activities, gave them a blank check, and the governments of Europe, many of them have provided the arms. They couldn't call for a ceasefire. They couldn't break the EU-Israel association agreement. Absolutely unbelievable when we think back that Thatcher and Reagan stopped arms to Israel in earlier days with far less, terrible wars on Lebanon and all of that, but nothing on the scale of what we've seen in Gaza. So, I find it very hard to deal with, because these people talk about human rights everywhere, but they've ensured that the devastation in Gaza continues. They couldn't care less about anybody over there, and they've no credibility whatsoever. And now we see the incredible solidarity all across Europe in support of Palestine and Gaza being suppressed by many European member states. You mentioned the Stop the War Coalition in Britain have been hauled in over initiatives that they organised. We've seen people in Germany, meetings being broken up, the police attending meetings in Germany, the wearing of a keffiyeh and stuff like that could land you in very big trouble in these states. So freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, all of these things that they insist for other countries and give out about other countries not doing, they're even worse than that. There's a chill factor coming in on Palestinian solidarity. And even countries like Ireland, which are lauded as being pro-Palestine, and obviously the people of Ireland very much are. We get it as a country that was occupied for so long ourselves. But the Irish government have only given rhetoric. They too have sold dual-use goods to Israel. They too have ensured the selling of Israeli bonds by our central bank to arm the war effort. They've been complicit as well. It's a double speak. They talk the talk, but their actions are different. And it's pretty bad. But on the other side, the people of Europe have been clear everywhere. And I mean everywhere. Like Germany, we know how chilling the factors are there, but last month attended a meeting of thousands of activists who were so clearly pro-Palestine and looking for ways to get organised. But then you have the bizarre...
You're no fan of Donald Trump or J.D. Vance, clearly, who come from a sort of Hayekian extreme right in terms of economics. But when J.D. Vance lectured the Europeans on freedom of speech, given the censorship, I understand the so-called, British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC in Britain, censoring a film on Palestine the other day. I don't know how it is in Ireland. As you say, it's better in Ireland. Did you sympathise with what J.D. Vance was lecturing these Europeans about as regards freedom of speech?
Totally right. He was 100% right. Just because somebody you may disagree with politically sometimes says things that are accurate or correct, or that's fair enough.
You're not going to get a
Right.
Make America Great hat, though.
Yeah, no, but I think this is really sad, because I think the problem is, and Trump and Vance identify very much with the far right, who are incredibly racist and anti-Palestine across Europe. But the left in Europe should be also taking up those causes, because they're absolutely correct. I mentioned it so many times in the Parliament, the authoritarianism coming from Europe and the discrimination against Russian-speaking citizens in the Baltic states never gets a mention, but it is prevalent. There are people in jail in the Baltic countries just for simply defending the right to speak Russian and so on. It's catastrophic. And yet they talk about civil liberties and human rights everywhere. They've abandoned international law. And I think this is what we saw with Gaza, because myself and Mick Wallace said that Gaza wasn't accidental. It was a warning. It was a harbinger of a new and much more violent world where international law was being publicly bonfired. We know international law was never really for the big boys, but it did help keep things a little bit in check. But by so flagrantly bonfiring it in the face of an openly declared and publicly carried out devastating genocide, they nailed their colours to the mast on that, and they've no right to speak really about rights anywhere. And the complete curtailment of civil liberties in Europe now is absolutely accelerating.
Clare Daly, thank you. That's it for the show. We'll be back again exploring the collapse of EU-UK power on Monday with Trump 2020 Advisory Board member and veteran US intelligence officer, Lieutenant Colonel Anthony Shaffer. Until then, keep in touch via all our social media if it's not censored in your country, and head to our channel Going Underground TV on rumble.com to watch new and old episodes of Going Underground. See you Monday.